Okay, folks, I'm back with part 2 of the Causes of Revolution video cast. Left off in class after day 1 talking about non-importation. Non-importation is a very simple concept. It's very difficult to carry it out. And the ways in which the colonists did this were by sort of harassing people who didn't agree to it and publishing the names of offenders in the newspapers. So if you were importing when you shouldn't have been, people in your community knew about it. This is combined with the Sons of Liberty, who have been they were quiet sort of after the Stamp Act, and they really picked it up when the township duties were enforced, and they create an atmosphere where we see a lot of mobs and physical resistance to these policies. Particularly in this case with non-importation, they go after the Board of Customs commissions, or committees rather, because they're corrupt. And essentially, at the same time, they're creating their own version of government within the colonies called these committees of correspondence to act as local government, spread ideas. They are writing each other frequently so that the feelings of the revolution are moving. These mobs that they're forming, and the next slide is going to be one of the most famous ones, which is the Boston Massacre, are actually somewhat conservative in their ways. I mean, the Sons of Liberty were really intelligent about making sure that they didn't get out of hand. They're not trying to completely overthrow a social structure or a government. They're merely trying to place some limits on those rulers. And yes, they're using these mobs, some physical violence at times, these newspapers, etc., to get what they want. And as I said, at the same time that they can make mobs more intense with propaganda, they can also put a stop to things and contain mobs when needed. And sort of the sort of end goal of all of this is to sort of preserve liberty in the colonies under the belief that sort of in England that had disappeared. So the first of these events that we talked about in class is the Boston Massacre. And obviously, I tell you a story, the town bells are ringing. There's a disagreement between people who work in Boston and the Redcoats. And it ends with Captain Prescott putting his redcoats in front of the customs house, which of course is, makes sense that would be where everyone gathers because that's where the taxes were collected. And that's where we have this altercation where one of the soldiers falls down. We have these muskets who discharge. 11 people are hit. This big incident. The incident's only going to get bigger when you see what Paul Revere drew, which is what you're looking at right now, and got moved across the colonies. The colonists' report of this incident actually gets to England before the English commanders, which is a lot more dumbed down, which you have in your DBQ. In addition to sort of the backlash that comes from the Boston Massacre, there are a couple other places where we have similar issues. In New York, we have something called the Golden Hill Riot, which is essentially like a brawl between Sons of Liberty and the Redcoats at a Liberty Tree in New York, where in the end the Redcoats are charging at the colonists with bayonets drawn, which is very interesting. But the next one we talked about was the Gaspee incident, which was a small ship that was trying to avoid paying the duty on whatever they were carrying. I don't know exactly. And they end up getting the British customs ship, which is called the Gaspee, to get beached on a sandbar when they were running away from it in Rhode Island. And the Sons of Liberty, who realize that this ship will probably get free when the tides change, don't let that happen, and they end up taking rowboats out to this ship that's now beached and burning it to the ground, which is symbolic, and of course propaganda comes out of this. And as I mentioned, there's a full investigation of this incident, which concludes nothing. And in the end, no one talks about what happened, who did it, whatever, and everyone has to move on. So the note that you're seeing on this slide is, why doesn't the war start then? And so we have the Boston Massacre in 1770, the Gaspee incident in 1772, and we're going to see the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And my first conversation briefly about the Golden Hill Riot was 1770 as well, January, a couple months before the Boston Massacre. There are a lot of physical altercations that don't lead to war. And we're going to try to figure out why that is. And the way I put it is, nothing is inevitable until the shooting actually starts. So the next one is the Boston Tea Party of 1773, which you see an image of it here, but also here. And this is where 50 to 150 men, which are all Bostonians, mostly Sons of Liberty, and those sympathetic to the cause, who dress up like Mohawks to dump 342 chests of tea in the bay in 3 hours. The ship has 20 days to unload its cargo in Boston. On the 19th day, in Boston, they meet and say, well, what are we going to do with this? Because they were enforcing non-importation. No one was allowed to have that tea because after the townshend duties were repealed, the only tax left was on tea. And in the end, the Sons of Liberty are very adamant that these chests of tea don't get undocked, unloaded, whatever, and they go and destroy it. What you see in these images is sort of the crowd cheering as this is happening. It wasn't the case. This was business as usual for the Sons of Liberty and the colonists, and it was to prove a point and to keep British policy in line with how the Americans felt, which is that they shouldn't be taxed without some sort of representation. And these tensions with the British only culminate with things like when the British would drill their soldiers on Sunday mornings in Boston Commons and impress Bostonians. They were known for swearing and being really drunk in town, and this was a constant ongoing issue between the British and the soldiers that they have in the colonies and the colonists, who are starting to view themselves as very different than those soldiers, but also different than the politics that are guiding their lives that's coming across the ocean. And nothing can be more indicative of that than the newspapers that are moving sort of the propaganda that we see in these incidents in the colonies versus the letters that are getting back to England after what the colonists are writing. And that's true for non-importation stuff that's been written in the newspaper, but also these propaganda images of these physical altercations. This is all going to lead us to the First Continental Congress, where we left off in class. And so the goal of this is to create sort of an American parliament that functions beneath the British Parliament, but at the same time they also address the issues of the day, which are things like non-importation, and they set up a mechanism through which to enforce that. And this is going to lead us into the final effort of the British to try to enforce their policy and their way and to make some money off the colonies who bled them dry during the French and Indian War. And this is the Coercive Acts. And they were called the Coercive Acts and also the Intolerable Acts because of how aggressive they were, particularly towards Massachusetts and Boston. And you see that with the Boston Port Bill and the Massachusetts Government Act. But in a lot of ways to make it easier on the British soldiers there, Quartering Act, Administration of Justice Act, and making it more difficult for Boston to resist in the way that they had. And this is going to lead us to, we talked about the Eatonton Tea Ladies, the resistance that has grown in Paul Revere's network that makes sure that they're closely watching what the British are doing so that if any false move, and the colonists will know about it and be ready to respond. And that's what we see with these powder alarms for General Gage, who's now in charge of the redcoats in the colonies, starts to go try to take the gunpowder away from the colonists. And at first it works. They get caught at a drawbridge once, and in the end, the last run is to Concord, where we end up with Paul Revere's ride, where Revere and Dawes warned everyone, and the Minutemen showed up at Lexington to prevent this from happening. And that's what you get with this map. And then the stars, the important point, starred point at the bottom is this is April of 1775, and we do not have a Declaration of Independence until 1776. We have months of time before this ends up being sort of a full-fledged revolution. There's still resistance at this time. Second Continental Congress will move that. Bunker Hill is physically a battle of the revolution. This will move us towards this, but it's not until we see a chance at peace, Thomas Paine's against his words against the British, and finally a Declaration of Independence that this rebellion becomes a full-scale revolution. We'll talk about those battles starting with Bunker Hill, starting tomorrow.